It's your boy Blackbeard Mirage. I'm back once again. Just continuing this Autochthonous history, on this Venus Day, or what you all know of as Friday. And we're going to dig a little deeper into basically some of these conflicts that we had going on in the Old South, all right? So in the previous tape, I kind of, briefly hinted at the French and Indian War, which was a war between, of course, Aboriginal Moors on both sides of the field between the French and the British, and then amalgamated Moors on both sides of the field between the French and the British. So you had, French and British people who were both amalgamated at this time period. It probably wasn't really a large population of Caucasians in power. Most of these Caucasians more than likely were still the serf class, the vassal class, or the slave class of a lot of these amalgamated Moors and a lot of these full-blooded Moors as well at this time. So, this is what's kind of going on. And now I want to take you a little more into the early 1800s, all right? Now, in the early 1800s, you have basically a lot of the conflicts that were the prelude to what we know of as the American Civil War. And a lot of us, in history, we've been told that the American Civil War was a war between Caucasians in the South and Caucasians in the North fighting the free so-called Negroes. And we all know by now that that's, a bunch of baloney. But we're going to look deeper into what it really was about. What it really was about was these, various European families who we call the United States. They needed some help coming into the deep South to fight against these Aboriginals in the South because they weren't able to really get the land from them. All right. It was all about land grabbing. OK, so you hear about these different, wars with the Seminole Aborigines in the South, or these wars in the Everglades dealing with this guy, Andrew Jackson, this bastard, and this bastard named General Custer as well. This is basically all the Civil War. So although we hear about the Civil War being from 1860 to 1865, that wouldn't be really that accurate to me. I would say, the American Civil War really was, I'd say early 1800s up until about 1865. So you could say that the American Civil War itself was 65 years. And in the late 1700s, around 1776, 1779, 1781, up until about the early 1800s, this is what you have the period of the so-called American Revolution. So we can say from about 1791 all the way to about 1865, this is a period where a lot of us were in deep conflict with these foreigners, and a lot of our identities and things were being switched around. So by the time Reconstruction came, not all of you just got the word Negro, African, and Indian everywhere. But they were setting that all up in the late 1700s and throughout the 1860s and early 1800s, excuse me. A good brother that you can look into that'll give you a lot more information on this is a brother by the name of Isir the Duke of Tears. His name is Isir the Duke of Tears. And, he's one of the only people that can take this Moorish information on an international perspective and tie it into, the Aboriginal Moors here in America. So I would recommend you just probably go on his page and just kind of look around and see some of the stuff he got. But he has a lot of rare information, and I would definitely reference him. So today I'm going to read a little bit about Fort Negro. All right. At Fort Negro, I've talked about this in a previous tape, but you had a fort that was located in about it was the northwestern part of Florida and in the southwestern part of so-called Georgia. OK. But it was a fort where basically a lot of our Aboriginal ancestors had their own military base. All right. So we're going to read deeper into that and what was going on at this time. OK. If you want to know my resource for where I'm reading, you can just look up Fort Negro 1816. And it's a PDF also as well, dealing with some Moorish information. And you can kind of find it if you can, But I'm going to go into this right here. So it's Fort Negro 1816. Now, although we're saying Negro, we really mean Moors, Aborigines, okay? In the evening of deputation of chiefs went into the fort and demanded its surrender, but they were abused and treated with the utmost contempt. The black chief heaped much abuse on the Americans. Now, these Americans we're talking about are the United States, and said he had been left in command of the fort by the British government, and that he would sink any American vessel that should attempt to pass it, and would blow up the fort if he could not defend it. The chief also informed me that the Negroes had a red flag and the English Jack was flying over it. So what you have right here is that a lot of these aboriginals in the South, like I told you all, some of them were teaming up with the British, some of them were teaming up with the French. Okay. Now, whether the French and British, upheld whatever their end of the contract was to where these, Aborigines would team up with them, well, clearly we know that they didn't do that. But we just reading into what was going on at the time. Okay. So the first thing you have is that these Moorish Aborigines, or these so-called Negroes, they were waving a red flag. All right. So the first thing is that our ancestors' flag was an all red flag with absolutely nothing on it. Okay. Let's keep going. The question that must be answered is, were these people former slaves? What was their purpose for flying the two flags they were flying? Slaves do not have flags. A flag represents a nation. What nation or nations did they represent? There were cannons in use at Fort Negro. It is a well-known fact in history that the cannon was developed by Moors in North Africa and Spain. So the first thing they're telling you is that these Aborigines in the South, or in Georgia and Florida, were waving an all red flag, and this flag was in company with the English Jack flag. Okay. Then the next thing they're saying is that it was well known in history that the cannon was developed by the Moors of so-called Spain and North Africa. Then it says that the Moors had not only made the fire stick as mentioned above, but even cannon forged from wrought iron. So this is where your history, where you get a lot of people say that the Moors taught the European about, firearms and weapons and things of this nature. So this is your confirmation that so-called black people or Aborigines, we were the ones that created, military weaponry. So this Caucasian man didn't create a gun and then come and use it against us. That's not how it went. He knew about the weapon and the firearm because of other Moors who already had these instruments. Okay. So that's the first thing I want you to kind of put in your mind. Let's continue. So remember now, I just told you that there were two flags. You had the English Jack flag and you had an all red flag. Let's see what each of these flags represented. The two flags represented Great Britain and the indigenous Moorish nation. Let me repeat. The two flags represented Great Britain and the indigenous Moorish Empire. They represent a nation of indigenous Moors. This is the same Islamic empire in the east that Abu Bakr, brother of Mansa Musa, was under when he brought 400 ships to America in 1311 AD. Is it this flag that the chief was flying at the Black Fort in Florida in 1816? Was there a continuous Moorish connection from 1311 with the arrival of Moors from the east that is documented in Africa and America until 1816? The documented dates for the presence of contemporary Eastern Moors goes as far back as 700 AD, as we have shown with the inscriptions found in the ancient Nevada school, bearing the name of Muhammad as the prophet of Allah. So we have right here, first they're telling us that these two flags that were found in Fort Negro, this all red flag and English Jack flag. They said this represented Great Britain, of course, which is the English Jack flag. And they said the all red flag represented the indigenous Moorish nation or the indigenous Moorish empire. So this is why sometimes you see a lot of these Moors with this all red flag. Now, in a minute, we will go into where the green star came from, because that was actually put on by the French a little bit later. But our ancestors were under an all red flag. OK. And they're also saying that this is the same Islamic empire in the east that Abu Bakr, the brother of Mansa Musa, was under when he brought 400 ships to America in 1311 AD. Now, a lot of us have heard this story of Abu Bakr and some of these Muslims from West Africa bringing ships over to the Americas in 1311 AD. But it also stems back much further to these contemporary Eastern Moors that date back to about 700 AD. Because in a previous tape, I read about an ancient rock that was found in Nevada, okay, in the western part of North America. But they found a rock that had inscriptions on it that were basically bearing the name of Muhammad as the prophet of Allah, that dated back to around 700 AD in Nevada. So you have a connection here. So you have the red indigenous Moorish flag that was being waved at Fort Negro in the southern part of Georgia and the northern part of Florida. So you have the Moorish flag being waved there. Then you have the Moorish flag being waved in 1311 when Abu Bakari, which is the brother of Mansa Musa, you all know of Mansa Musa and him and his gold. But you have that same red flag showing up in 1311, okay, which was hundreds of years, of course, before 1816. So in 1311, you had this all red flag being waved. That was in America. And then in 1816, you have this all red flag being waved in America, okay, by the same people. So what I'm telling you is that these Moors that you call, you know what I'm saying, Muslims from so-called West Africa, a lot of them been coming over here even before the 700s AD. And some of them came and then they stayed here, okay? Now you got to remember that when they came, it was already groups of Aborigines here. And then they came and then they made themselves a new home, all right? So they didn't go back to West Africa. So you have in the early ADs where a lot of Moors came over here. Also, I want you to think about this. You also hear about the Moors going into the Iberian Peninsula in 711 AD. Okay, you hear about the Moors going into the Iberian Peninsula in 711 AD. So in 711 AD, you have some Moors going into the Iberian Peninsula. And in 700 AD, you have some Moors coming over here to the Americas. So this is why I say that, you know, you got to be careful when you look at these Moors in Europa because you don't know where they're from. Some of them could have been from over here. Okay. And not all these Moors that went into Europa were from Africa or so-called the Middle East. All right. Let's continue. What kind of flag is Moorish? It is a red flag with a 5-pointed green star in the. Is it a red flag with a 5-pointed green star in the center? Let's continue. The Moorish flag, as represented by Noble Drew Ali. There is an unverified story that George Washington took down the original Moorish Islamic flag in America and locked it in a safe at Independence Hall in Philadelphia. It was allegedly a part of his efforts to destroy any knowledge of Islam amongst black people in the budding American nation. Allegedly, it was not retrieved until Noble Drew Ali was given the flag by high-degree Shriners in the 1920s. The Moorish flag was actually dismantled in 1816 from Fort Negro by Colonel Duncan Clinch and Andrew Jackson. So remember, I just told you all that in the early 1800s, which led up to the Civil War, you had that guy General Custer, and you had this guy Andrew Jackson, and you have this guy Colonel Duncan Clinch, and it's a host of other ones. But when they were coming into the South, they were coming into the South to fight these Aboriginal Islamic Moors that were in the South, and they had a military base known as Fort Negro. And they're saying right here that the original Moorish Islamic flag was supposedly taken down by George Washington and locked in Independence Hall in Philadelphia. And he did this because he didn't want the Aboriginal so-called black people to have that conscious connection with the old Islamic bloodlines that they came from. Okay, so when you all hear this allegorical Masonic story of George Washington chopping down the cherry tree, what they're talking about is George Washington removing the all red Moorish flag, okay, and locking it up. And Noble Drew Ali was given this flag by some Shriners in the early 1900s, excuse me. Now, we should all know who the Shriners are by now, okay? These Caucasian men who actually profess to uphold the Moorish Islamic Empire behind closed doors, but in the daytime, you know, they act as if they're Christian, all right? Let's continue. So let's go into this green star, because I just told you all that our ancestors had a all red flag. It had no star on it. So let's look into where the star came from. The star was added by the colonizing French authority to the Moorish Sharifan flag in Morocco on November the 17th, 1915, after France's colonial occupation began. Before this period, it was a completely red flag. So here you have right here that in 1915, the French, and by now they are Caucasian French. So it's not Moorish France. You know what I'm saying? It's not, you know, it's not even amalgamated Moors now. By now, it's just full-blooded Caucasians. And they're saying that in 1915, that the Moroccan or the Moorish flag had a green star added on it, okay? And it said prior to that, it was completely red. And this was added after the colonizing the French colonial occupation began, excuse me, okay? Now, I also kind of think this in mind. Now, although I'm saying that these were Caucasian French, and although they added this green star to our red flag, you got to remember that even these original Frenchmen were Moors. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind, because the five-pointed star is not a Caucasian symbol. It is the symbol of the Moor. You know what I'm saying? It's the symbol of the Aborigine. It is the symbol of the arm, leg, arm, and head. It is a symbol of ether or spirit, fire, earth, air, and water. Okay, so you have fire, earth, air, water, and spirit, which represent the five elements of man. So that's what that five-pointed star represents. So although the French put it on there, they still uphold a certain Moorish tradition, believe it or not. Okay, let's continue. So this completely red flag, all right, or this red flag with the green star, it represented the Muslim or the Moors of the Maghreb, which is West Africa and the Americas, who were traveling back and forth from Africa to America, who were established as indigenous to both lands. Let me repeat. So this red flag you see now, because sometimes you see these Moors, they'll either have an all red flag or they'll have a red flag with a green star. What does this star mean? And what does this flag mean? And what does it represent? It represented the Muslims or the Moors of the Maghreb. The Maghreb is West Africa and the Americas. Okay. So when we say the Maghreb, we mean North, Central, and South America. That's the Maghreb. Okay. The western half of the Islamic Empire. It says that it represented the Moors of the Maghreb who were traveling back and forth from Africa to America, who were established as indigenous to both lands. Many of the Maroons who were amongst the natives were called Seminoles, were Muslims or Moors who had an ancient presence in America. The chief of this fort, called Fort Negro, was a man of Mandi descent. The Mandi were/are West African Muslims. Mandi groups founded the medieval empires of Ghana and Mali. They include the Bambara, the Eula, Malinke, Mandi, Dogon, and Sinke. So before we move on, so the first thing it says that this red flag with the green star, or the all red flag, represented the Muslims or the Moors of West Africa and the Americas. And this is why you hear people say that Morocco is a perpetual state. If you hear the brother Asir talk, he will say that Morocco is a perpetual state. And the reason why he's saying that, because Morocco isn't just West Africa, it's also the Americas too. Because we've been basically tricked when it comes to the western part of the Islamic Empire, because a lot of us didn't know really where our ancestors came from. We didn't know their religion or their culture. A lot of us, got to be real, we didn't say we didn't know that. And, when I first probably started telling some of you all that it was Islamic, you probably didn't really fully see the connection. But this connection stems from what I said a little bit earlier, that these Muslims or these Moors of the Americas and so-called Africa were traveling back and forth, and they were established as indigenous to both lands. So this is why you have people in so-called West Africa that are from like Nigeria, etc., how they look a whole lot. They look a lot like, the indigenous people here in America. All right. Now, although they have certain features, because of the genetic pool and stuff that, it still is not going to be fully the same. But nevertheless, a lot of people from so-called West Africa, they do favor us when it comes to the look. Some of the men even in Nigeria or West Africa can grow the same type of beards as the brothers here in the Americas. OK, so, they're telling you right here that we were indigenous to both land masses. So, yes, you all are indigenous to Africa, but at the same time, you're not directly indigenous to Africa. You're directly indigenous to America. OK. Then it says that many of the Maroons or Moors, because that's another word for Moor is maroon. Many of the Maroons were also amongst the natives were called Seminoles, and they were Muslims who had an ancient presence in America. So now I'm going into the Florida Seminoles, okay, and the different Aborigines of the Everglades, the different Aborigines of Georgia and Florida, okay. A lot of these people were known as Seminoles, quote unquote, but these Seminoles were actually Muslims, and they had an ancient presence in America. All right, let's continue. It says the chief at Fort Negro during the invasion of Connell Clinch was named Abraham. His birth name was Sonofi Tustanugi, which meant Swanee warrior, and has been associated with the Swanee River in Florida. Now, first of all, you have this brother who was the chief at Fort Negro, this Aboriginal Muslim. And they're saying that his name was Safuni Tustanugi, but his name means Swanee warrior. Okay. And it's associated with the Swanee River in Florida. Also, too, that you have a Swanee located in Georgia as well. It's in North Georgia. So not only do you have a Swanee in Florida, but you also have a Swanee in Georgia, showing you the connection between the people. The Moorish Mandi Arabic word Sofuni means powerful spirit, and Tustanugi means warrior. So this brother was, his brother's name meant powerful spiritual warrior. I'll pause it real quick. My phone is ringing. Hold on. So this brother's name meant spiritual, powerful warrior. Okay. Hold on real quick, y'all. Hello? Just working on some little stuff. Oh, all right. Yeah, but anyway, sorry about that. So it says that this chief, who had a Moorish heritage like most of the Maroons in Florida, was not a former slave. So this Moorish Aborigine chief of Fort Negro said that he had Moorish heritage and, like most of the Maroons in Florida, was not a slave. So these Seminoles were not slaves. So the word Seminole doesn't mean runaway slave. All right. His descendancy went back to indigenous peoples. Abraham served as an interpreter for the Seminoles and as legal counsel for John Jumper and Chief Billy Bowlegs. And their Aboriginal names, Chief Billy Bowlegs was Holata Miko, and John Jumper's Aboriginal name was Himha Miko. All right. It says Himha Miko was the Seminole chief. His brother Holota Miko was also a chief. Abraham served as a representative on their trip to Washington, D.C. to negotiate a treaty with the United States government in 1832. Okay. So check this out. Then we'll wrap it up. The Moors dominated trade during this period. Trade was dominated by the Moors from the west and north coast of Africa to the Gulf of Mexico before the Inquisition of the Spanish and the slow deterioration of the Muslim and Islamic influence. Even in the 1700s, the rial was the unit of currency used in Mexico, which is the present standard currency of Saudi Arabia. So it says in the early 1700s that the currency used in Mexico was also the same standard currency used in Saudi Arabia. So if there was no connection between the Americas and Saudi Arabia, why is currency in Mexico the same currency being used in Saudi Arabia? This trade became fully interrupted when the United States developed an independent Marine Corps and the Navy in the 1800s. Okay, so it said that this trade, it was disrupted by the United States Navy. They fought wars against the Moors on the Barbary Coast and eventually won out in these confrontations. They later fought wars against our people in Mexico, or Amexem. The hymn of the Marines declares that they have fought from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, referring to the exploits by the United States Marine Corps in the Mexican War and in campaigns against the Barbary pirates of North Africa. Those Barbary pirates and some of the so-called Mexicans were Moors. The Black Maroons, or Moors from Florida, who had set up communities in Mexico in the mid-1800s. The cannon was also found amongst the so-called Mexicans, which was a signature weapon of the Moors and the Maroons of Florida, at places like Palicalia Caja, a city built by Maroons or Moors in Florida, and Fort Negro, where the black Moorish chief Sanufi Tustanugi, or Abraham, was captured by Colonel Duncan Clinch. So basically, I just want to go into, some of the Aboriginal presence in the South, dealing with the military, okay? A lot of this stuff was wars and it was military. So you got to remember that, our people really were never slaves. Anybody that you've seen in kind of any indentured servitude or slavish position was more than likely one of these Moors that was captured from some of these wars. And they were from some of these different Islamic states that our people had dominion over. So, we don't come from a slave culture. We come from, a rich empire. You know what I'm saying? We come from a nation. And that nation was being symbolized by that all red flag. So this is why you will see some Moors in America wear that all red flag with the green star on it. Now, was the green star put on by the colonizing bleached out French? Yes, it was. But nevertheless, this was also probably done by them to, once again, bring more confusion. So it would be harder for us to kind of tie all this back together, because if you could see just an all red flag, and then you can go in history and see that in Fort Negro in Georgia and Florida, that these Maroons or these Seminoles also had an all red flag, you would quickly correlate, those old Moors in the East to these Moors in the West, But it's the boy Blackbeard Mirage. I just want to go over some Autochthonous history and just understand that it was American Aboriginal Moors and Moors in the Far East that was trading. And it says that the Moors dominated trade in this period, and trade was dominated by the Moors from the west and north coast of Africa to the Gulf of Mexico before the Inquisition of the Spanish and the slow deterioration of the Moorish and Islamic influences. And it says even in the 1700s, the real was the unit of currency in Mexico, which is the present standard currency of Saudi Arabia. And it said this trade became fully interrupted when the United States developed an independent Marine Corps and Navy in the 1800s. So that's where the trade line stopped. You know what I'm saying? So Abu Bakari and a lot of these Muslims from so-called the Levant in Africa, when they would come over here and we would trade things with them back and forth, you know what I'm saying? They would bring over Arabic and Hebrew cultures, etc. And then we would show them our Arabic and Hebrew cultures, trade the food and the different things we were trading. And this is what was going on. So that's why in Mexico, the same standard currency, it used to be Arabic. And this is the same currency you see being used in the Islamic worlds today, But nevertheless, though, the flag was an all red flag. And it was a flag that stood for freedom, justice, equality. Okay. And, George Washington chopped down a cherry tree. You know what I'm saying? So this is why black people have no freedom. They have no equality and they have no justice. A cult and esoterically symbolized by George Washington chopping down the cherry tree. Okay. It's the boy Blackbeard Mirage. Stay tuned for the next one. I'm out.